The police officer pointed at the black woman in uniform and shouted, "Step away from the vehicle." Now, every conversation in the parking lot stopped. Every head turned. Even the wind seemed to pause for a moment. The woman didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't reach for anything. She simply looked at the officer and calmly said, "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The young cop's hand immediately moved toward his holster. That was when the entire situation started moving in the wrong direction. The annual Veterans Leadership Summit drew people from all over the state. Retired soldiers, active duty officers, military families, ROTC cadets, local officials. The event was supposed to celebrate service, honor, sacrifice. Instead, it was about to become something very different. General Evelyn Brooks had arrived nearly 30 minutes early, as she always did. The 61-year-old Army officer believed punctuality was a form of respect for the event, for the people attending, for the uniform she wore. The morning sun reflected softly off the rows of parked vehicles surrounding the convention center. Flags moved gently above the entrance. Volunteers prepared registration tables. Guests greeted old friends. Everything felt normal, peaceful, predictable. Ethan Brooks walked beside his grandmother carrying a garment bag and several folders. The 17-year-old ROTC cadet looked equal parts nervous and excited. Today mattered to him. A lot. "You nervous?" The general glanced toward him. The question made Ethan laugh. "A little. A little." The teenager smiled. "Okay. A lot." A faint smile appeared on Evelyn's face. Rare. Brief. Meaningful because it was rare. "You'll be fine." The answer came calmly. The same way she answered most things. No speeches. No dramatic motivation. Just quiet confidence. The teenager nodded. Somehow her answers always worked, even when they were only 3 words long. They crossed the parking lot toward the convention center entrance. People recognized the uniform immediately. Several veterans nodded respectfully. Others smiled. One retired Marine even stopped to shake her hand. "Good seeing you again, General." "You too, Frank." Simple, friendly, ordinary. Nothing about the morning suggested trouble. Until a woman near the far side of the parking lot suddenly started shouting. "That's him." The voice cut across the lot. Sharp. Panicked. Everyone looked. A middle-aged woman pointed toward a black SUV parked several rows away. 2 police officers immediately turned. One spoke into his radio. The other began moving quickly toward the vehicle. Within seconds, the atmosphere changed. The way it always does when law enforcement arrives unexpectedly. Conversations stopped. People watched. Speculation started. Ethan frowned. "What happened?" The general looked toward the disturbance, then quietly answered, "Not sure." Police vehicles entered the lot moments later. Lights flashing. Radios crackling. The energy shifted immediately. The event organizers looked confused. Guests stepped aside. People began filming. Officer Tyler Reed climbed from one of the cruisers. 28 years old. Ambitious. Confident. Eager to prove himself. His attention immediately settled on the black SUV. The same SUV parked beside Evelyn's vehicle. The officer spoke briefly with the woman who made the report. She pointed again. Excited. Certain. Then something unexpected happened. The witness pointed in the wrong direction. Directly toward General Evelyn Brooks. The officer turned. Looked at the woman in uniform. Then looked at the SUV. Then back at her. Something clicked in his mind. Something wrong. But powerful. Assumption. Officer Reed started walking. Fast. Purposeful. Certain. The kind of certainty people often have right before making mistakes. Ethan noticed first. "Grandma." The teenager's voice sounded uneasy. The general followed his gaze. The officer was approaching rapidly now. Hand resting near his duty belt. Expression hard. Focused. Several nearby veterans noticed too. Conversations faded. Eyes followed the movement. Officer Reed stopped 10 feet away. Then raised his voice. "Step away from the vehicle." Silence. Pure silence. Ethan blinked. "What?" The general remained calm. Completely calm. "I'm sorry, officer." The response came politely. "Step away from the vehicle." This time louder. More aggressive. Several people nearby exchanged confused looks. A retired Army colonel frowned immediately. Something felt wrong. The general glanced toward her vehicle. Then back toward the officer. "That's my vehicle." The officer shook his head. "Ma'am, step away from it now." Ethan stared, unable to process what was happening. The woman standing beside him had spent decades serving her country. She wore a perfectly pressed army uniform. Her rank insignia was clearly visible. Nothing about this made sense. The general looked toward the officer, then calmly asked, "May I ask why?" The question seemed reasonable, normal, professional. Officer Reed interpreted it differently. "As of right now, you're being detained while we investigate a report." The words echoed across the parking lot. People immediately stopped walking, stopped talking, stopped pretending not to watch. The general remained silent for several seconds. Not angry, not afraid, thinking, observing, the same way she had spent most of her career doing. Finally, she nodded once. Slowly, "I understand." The answer seemed to surprise the officer. Perhaps he expected resistance, arguments, emotion. Instead, he received cooperation. The general handed her folders to Ethan, then looked toward her grandson. "Stay calm." The teenager stared. "Grandma, stay calm." The second time sounded softer, but somehow firmer. Ethan immediately fell silent. Around them, more people were gathering. More phones appeared. More eyes watched. The officer stepped forward, the distance between them shrinking, the tension growing, and standing in the middle of a parking lot filled with veterans, military families, and community leaders. General Evelyn Brooks had the strange feeling this wasn't going to end the way Officer Tyler Reed expected. Because sometimes the biggest mistakes don't begin with bad intentions. They begin with assumptions. Officer Tyler Reed took another step forward, then another. The parking lot had become completely silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that forms when hundreds of people realize something unusual is happening. Veterans stopped walking. Families stopped talking. Volunteers froze behind registration tables. Phones appeared everywhere. General Evelyn Brooks stood exactly where she was. Hands visible, posture relaxed, expression calm. The same composure she'd carried through decades of military service. The same composure Ethan had seen his entire life. The officer pointed toward the vehicle. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the SUV immediately." The general nodded once, then took 2 slow steps backward, exactly as instructed. For a moment, it seemed like the situation might settle down. Maybe somebody would verify her identity. Maybe somebody would notice the stars on her shoulders. Maybe somebody would ask a question before making assumptions. Instead, a second patrol unit arrived. Then a third. The flashing lights reflected across the convention center windows. Blue, red, blue, red. The colors washed across military uniforms and veteran jackets. The entire scene felt surreal. Ethan stared in disbelief. "Grandma, tell them who you are." The general glanced toward him, then quietly said, "They'll figure it out." The answer shocked him, because right now, it looked like nobody was trying to figure anything out. Officer Reed spoke into his radio. Another officer approached. A sergeant, mid-40s, broad shoulders, serious expression. Nameplate, Mark Benson. The sergeant listened briefly, looked toward Evelyn, then toward the SUV, then back toward the witness standing nearby. The woman immediately pointed again. "That's her." The general watched the interaction quietly, observing, assessing, the same way she'd spent years evaluating situations before speaking. Sergeant Benson walked forward. "You mind providing identification?" The request sounded more professional, more reasonable. "Of course." The general reached slowly toward her uniform pocket, every movement deliberate, every movement visible. She produced a military identification card, then handed it over. The sergeant examined it. His eyes moved across the card, then back toward her, then back toward the card again. A brief moment passed, a very important moment, the kind where situations can still be corrected. Then something strange happened. Officer Reed laughed, not loudly, just enough. "Come on." The young officer shook his head. "Anybody can buy a fake ID." Several nearby veterans exchanged stunned looks. One retired Navy commander actually blinked twice, certain he had misheard. The general remained silent. Sergeant Benson looked uncertain now, not convinced, not comfortable, but uncertainty wasn't enough. Not anymore. The situation already had momentum, and momentum is dangerous. The witness stepped forward again. "I told you that's her." The woman pointed toward the SUV. "That's the woman I saw." Nobody asked the obvious question. Saw doing what? Saw where? Saw when? The accusation remained vague. Yet somehow it kept growing. Ethan could feel it happening. The story becoming reality simply because enough people repeated it. This is ridiculous. The words escaped before he could stop them. Every officer immediately looked toward him. The teenager's heart jumped. But before anyone could respond, the general spoke. Ethan. Just his name. Nothing else. The teenager immediately fell silent. Again, because somehow one word from her carried more authority than shouting ever could. The general looked towards Sergeant Benson. May I ask what exactly I'm accused of? The question sounded calm, professional, reasonable. The sergeant hesitated, just briefly. Then, we received a report involving suspicious activity and a possible vehicle match. Silence. The general glanced toward the SUV, then back toward him. A vehicle match. The phrase seemed to hang in the air. Yes, ma'am. Several veterans nearby exchanged uncomfortable looks, because suddenly the situation sounded much weaker than before. A possible vehicle match. Not evidence. Not proof. A vehicle. Officer Reed seemed to realize it too, because his voice immediately became firmer, more aggressive. We're still investigating. The general nodded. I understand. Again, no resistance, no argument, no attitude. That somehow frustrated the young officer even more, because people expecting confrontation often don't know what to do with dignity. The parking lot continued filling with spectators. Phones recording, whispers spreading, questions multiplying. One older veteran stepped forward, silver-haired, Marine Corps jacket. Officer, that woman is a... Officer Reed cut him off immediately. Sir, stay back. The veteran stared, speechless, not because he feared the officer, because he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The general noticed. Of course she did. She gave the man a small shake of her head, almost invisible. The message was clear. Don't interfere. The veteran reluctantly stepped back, still stunned. Officer Reed looked toward Evelyn, then toward his sergeant. Something had changed. The young officer had committed publicly now. People were watching, recording, observing. Backing down would feel embarrassing, and embarrassed people often make worse decisions. The general seemed to understand that too. For several seconds, she said nothing, then quietly asked, Sergeant, am I being detained? Silence. The question forced an answer, a real answer. The sergeant looked toward Officer Reed, then toward the crowd, then back toward the general. Finally, yes. The word landed heavily. Ethan felt his stomach drop. The crowd reacted immediately. Whispers, murmurs, disbelief. Then came the moment nobody expected. Officer Reed reached for his handcuffs. The metallic click echoed across the parking lot. Sharp, unmistakable. Several veterans visibly stiffened. A woman near the registration table covered her mouth. Someone stopped recording for a second because they genuinely couldn't believe what was happening. The general looked down briefly at the handcuffs, then back toward the officer. No anger, no fear, no panic, just disappointment. And standing in the middle of a parking lot filled with veterans, military families, and community leaders, General Evelyn Brooks had the unmistakable feeling that the situation was about to move far beyond a simple misunderstanding. Because some mistakes end when facts appear. Others grow worse because nobody wants to admit they were wrong. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed across the parking lot. Sharp, cold, unmistakable. Nobody spoke. For a brief moment, it felt like the entire Veterans Leadership Summit had stopped breathing. Officer Tyler Reed held the cuffs in one hand, confident, certain, completely unaware of how many people around him suddenly looked horrified. General Evelyn Brooks lowered her eyes briefly toward the handcuffs, then looked back at the officer. Her expression never changed. No anger, no fear, no panic, just calm. The same calm she'd carried through wars, crises, and responsibilities most people would never understand. Ethan stared. His brain refused to process what was happening. The woman standing in front of him wasn't just his grandmother. She was General Evelyn Brooks, a woman whose entire life had been dedicated to serving the country. And now, she was about to be handcuffed in front of hundreds of people. Officer. The general's voice remained soft. Professional. Officer Reed stepped closer. Turn around. The crowd reacted immediately. Whispers spread through the parking lot. Phones continued recording. Several veterans exchanged stunned looks. One retired Army colonel took a step forward, then stopped himself. The general had already asked everyone not to interfere. Still, the disbelief was becoming impossible to hide. Ethan finally couldn't take it anymore. This is insane. His voice cracked. louder than intended. Every nearby officer turned toward him. The teenager immediately felt the pressure, the attention, the authority. Before anyone could respond, the general spoke. Ethan. Just his name. Again. Nothing more. The teenager clenched his jaw, then looked away, silent, because somehow she could calm an entire room with a single word. Officer Reed seemed irritated now. The growing crowd, the recording phones, the questions, everything. People were watching, and the more people watched, the harder it became for him to reconsider. Embarrassment had entered the situation. That made everything worse. Ma'am, turn around. The officer's tone sharpened. The general nodded once, then slowly complied. No resistance, no argument, no drama. The movement somehow made the situation even harder to watch. A woman near the registration tent lowered her phone, unable to look directly at it. Several veterans stood with folded arms, expressions hard, uncomfortable. One elderly Marine quietly muttered, "Good Lord." The general placed her hands behind her back. The perfectly pressed army uniform suddenly seemed more visible than ever. The service ribbons, the insignia, the rank, everything. Yet somehow nobody with authority seemed willing to acknowledge it. Officer Reed secured one cuff. Then the second. The metallic sound echoed again. Click. Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind people felt in their chest. Ethan looked away, for the first time all morning, because watching felt worse. The general noticed immediately. Of course she did. You don't have to look away. The words were directed at him. Not the officers. Not the crowd. The teenager looked back, confused. The general offered a faint smile. Small. Almost invisible. Then, character matters most when things are uncomfortable. Silence. The sentence landed differently than everything else that morning. Several nearby veterans lowered their eyes. Not because of shame, because they understood exactly what she meant. Officer Reed guided her toward the patrol vehicle. The action felt surreal, like watching reality get something wrong. The crowd slowly parted, creating a path. Phones followed every movement, every step, every second. The general walked calmly, shoulders straight, head high, not because she was trying to make a statement, because dignity had become habit. That somehow made the entire scene harder to watch. Near the entrance of the convention center, a young ROTC cadet stood frozen, watching, then another, and another. Soon dozens of cadets were silently observing. Future officers, future leaders. None of them spoke, but every one of them would remember this. Officer Reed opened the rear door of the patrol vehicle, then paused. For the first time all morning, uncertainty crossed his face. Briefly, very briefly, because standing this close to the general created a strange feeling. A feeling he couldn't explain. Nothing about her seemed guilty. Nothing about her seemed intimidated. Nothing about her seemed uncertain. Most people changed when handcuffs appeared. She hadn't changed at all. The officer pushed the thought aside immediately. Procedure. Focus on procedure. That's what he told himself. The general carefully entered the back seat. The handcuffs limited her movement slightly. Nothing more. The door closed. The sound echoed through the parking lot. And for a moment, nobody moved. The convention center, the veterans, the cadets, the officers, the spectators. Everyone simply watched. Inside the patrol vehicle, General Evelyn Brooks looked through the window toward her grandson. Ethan stood motionless, angry, confused, humiliated. The general met his eyes, then gave a small nod. A message. Simple, clear. Stay steady. The teenager swallowed hard, then nodded back. The patrol vehicle started moving. Slowly, carefully, pulling away from the convention center. The crowd watched it leave. The flashing lights disappeared beyond the parking lot entrance. The noise faded. The event remained. But the atmosphere had changed completely. Near the registration tent, Sergeant Mark Benson stood quietly watching the cruiser disappear. Something about the situation bothered him now. A lot. Not the arrest. The certainty. The certainty that had existed before anyone verified anything. The certainty that somehow felt weaker with every passing minute. The sergeant looked toward the military identification card still resting in his hand, then toward the road where the patrol vehicle had vanished. For the first time that morning, he found himself asking a question nobody had bothered asking earlier. What if they had just made a very serious mistake? And miles away, sitting calmly in the back of a police cruiser while still wearing her army uniform, General Evelyn Brooks had the unmistakable feeling that the hardest part of the day was only beginning. The police station looked exactly the way most police stations looked. Bright fluorescent lights, gray walls, plastic chairs, the faint smell of old coffee and printer toner. A place built for procedures. Not reflection, not doubt, just procedures. General Evelyn Brooks sat quietly in an interview room wearing handcuffs and a perfectly pressed Army uniform. The contrast felt strange, even to the officers walking past the glass window. The room contained a metal table, 3 chairs, a security camera, mounted high on the wall. Nothing else. The general sat with her hands folded calmly in front of her. Back straight, expression neutral, patient. The same posture she'd maintained for years during military briefings, congressional hearings, command reviews, crisis meetings. The setting had changed. She hadn't. Outside the room, Officer Tyler Reed walked through the hallway carrying paperwork. His confidence had returned, at least outwardly. The arrest was complete. The suspect was secured. The process was moving forward. Everything felt under control again. Or so he told himself. Still, something bothered him. The military identification card. He had seen plenty of fake IDs before. Plenty. But something about this one refused to leave his thoughts. The photograph matched. The security features looked legitimate. The rank insignia matched the name. Everything matched. Too well. The officer pushed the thought aside. People forged things. People lied. People pretended. That was easier to believe. Meanwhile, Sergeant Mark Benson sat at a nearby desk reviewing the incident report. For the 4th time. Then the 5th. Then the 6th. Something felt wrong. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just wrong. The witness statement remained vague. Extremely vague. Vehicle match. Possible suspect. Similar description. Nothing solid. Nothing concrete. The sergeant rubbed his forehead. The longer he looked at the paperwork, the less he liked it. Across the room, another officer walked past carrying a tablet, then paused. Hey. The sergeant looked up. What? The officer hesitated. Then, why do we have an Army general in interview room too? Silence. Benson stared. What? The officer held up the booking information. The military identification had already been entered into the system. Automatically. Digitally. Without anyone paying much attention. The screen displayed the name. The rank. The branch. General Evelyn Brooks. United States Army. The sergeant felt something tighten in his stomach. Let me see that. The tablet changed hands. The screen glowed beneath fluorescent lights. Everything looked official. Everything looked real. Too real. Officer Reed noticed the exchange. Immediately. What? The sergeant showed him the screen. The young officer barely glanced at it, then shrugged. So. The answer surprised Benson. So. The sergeant lowered the tablet. Tyler. Silence. Then, what if that's actually real? The younger officer laughed. Not because it was funny. Because admitting the alternative felt uncomfortable. Come on. The confidence sounded forced now. Much more forced. People fake military stuff all the time. Nobody answered. Because nobody seemed completely convinced anymore. The room had changed. Subtly, but noticeably. Doubt had arrived. And doubt spreads quickly. Inside interview room 2, the general remained alone. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. A clock ticked softly on the wall. The air conditioner hummed overhead. The station moved around her. Busy. Normal. Routine. None of it seemed to bother her. A young officer eventually entered carrying a bottle of water. The officer looked nervous. Very nervous. Not because of rank. Not yet. Because of presence. The general had that effect on people. Water, ma'am. The officer immediately seemed embarrassed after saying ma'am. The general accepted the bottle. Thank you. Simple. Polite. The young officer nodded awkwardly. Then left. The interaction lasted maybe 10 seconds. Yet somehow, he exited the room feeling worse than when he entered. Because guilty people rarely behave this way. 2 hours later the station had grown quieter. The initial excitement had faded. The paperwork remained. The uncertainty remained. And General Evelyn Brooks remained exactly the same. Patient. Calm. Waiting. Sergeant Benson eventually entered the interview room, closed the door behind him, then sat down across from her. For several seconds neither spoke. The general simply observed him. Not aggressively. Not suspiciously. Just observing. The same way she seemed to observe everything. Finally Benson cleared his throat. Can I ask you a question? The general nodded. Of course. The sergeant hesitated. Then, why are you so calm? Silence. The question surprised even him. Not, are you innocent? Not, where were you this morning? Why are you calm? The general looked toward the security camera briefly, then back toward him. A faint smile appeared. Because eventually, silence. Then, you learn that panic never improves the outcome. The words settled quietly inside the room. The sergeant stared. The answer sounded simple. Too simple. Yet somehow it carried the weight of experience. The kind people earned, not borrowed. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Benson looked toward the military ribbons on her uniform. The insignia, the stars, the details he should have paid attention to earlier. And for the first time that day, he found himself wondering whether everyone in the building was standing at the edge of a mistake much larger than they realized. Outside the interview room, Officer Reed continued filling out paperwork, trying very hard not to think about possibilities, trying very hard not to think about doubts, trying very hard not to think about the name now sitting inside the station database. General Evelyn Brooks. Because somewhere deep down, a question had begun forming. A dangerous question. And once certain questions appear, they become impossible to ignore, especially when the answers are already on their way. The police station felt different now. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough. The kind of change people noticed without being able to explain it. The phones rang a little more often. Conversations became quieter. Doors closed more carefully. And every time someone walked past interview room 2, they looked inside. General Evelyn Brooks remained seated at the same metal table. The same chair. The same room. The same calm expression. Hours had passed. Nothing about her had changed. That was becoming increasingly difficult for people to ignore. Sergeant Mark Benson stood near the front desk reviewing paperwork again. And again. And again. The repetition wasn't helping. If anything, it made things worse. The original witness statement still felt weak. Very weak. Vehicle match. Possible identification. Suspicious activity. The more he read it, the less substantial it seemed. A dispatcher appeared beside the desk, holding another printout. Mark. The sergeant looked up. What? The dispatcher handed him the page. Vehicle registration. Silence. Benson examined the document, then frowned, then read it again. The black SUV. The same SUV that started everything. Registered owner, General Evelyn Brooks. The sergeant slowly lowered the paper. What? The dispatcher shrugged. That's what came back. Silence. Not because the information proved anything. Because it removed one more explanation. The vehicle wasn't stolen. Wasn't hidden. Wasn't suspicious. It belonged to her. Exactly as she claimed. Across the room, Officer Tyler Reed noticed the exchange. What now? The sergeant handed him the registration. The younger officer read it, then immediately responded. So? The answer sounded weaker this time. Much weaker. Because even he knew the list of coincidences was growing shorter. The military ID matched. The vehicle matched. The name matched. The service records matched. Sooner or later, something had to give. Meanwhile, inside the interview room, the general quietly observed the clock on the wall. Not impatiently, not nervously, simply observing. The same way she'd spent decades observing timelines. Operations. People. Decisions. A knock came at the door. A young female officer entered carrying a folder. She looked nervous. Very nervous. Ma'am. The word slipped out automatically. The officer immediately seemed embarrassed. The general smiled faintly. Yes. The young woman hesitated. Then, can I ask something? Silence. Then a nod. The officer glanced toward the military ribbons. The stars. The uniform. Were you really in the army? The question wasn't disrespectful. It sounded genuine. Almost childlike. The general looked down briefly at her uniform. Then back up. Yes. Nothing more. The officer waited. Perhaps expecting a story. An explanation. Something dramatic. Instead, the general simply sat quietly. The young woman smiled awkwardly. Then asked, for how long? The general thought about it. Most of my adult life. Silence. The officer nodded slowly. Then looked toward the door. Thank you. And left. The entire conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet somehow, it spread through the station almost immediately. Not because of what was said. Because of how it was said. No anger. No arrogance. No threats. No demands. Just dignity. People noticed. By late afternoon, the station's internal atmosphere had shifted even further. Questions were appearing. Real questions. One officer checked military databases. Another reviewed dispatch recordings. A third re-examined the witness statement. Nobody announced it. Nobody coordinated it. Doubt was doing the work on its own. At the convention center, Evelyn Brooks sat alone near the edge of the nearly empty auditorium. The summit continued without him. Speakers came and went. Presentations happened. Applause echoed. None of it mattered. The teenager stared at his phone, waiting. Every minute felt longer than the last. Several veterans approached throughout the afternoon, offering support, offering encouragement, offering stories about the general. One retired command sergeant major sat beside him. "You okay?" Ethan shrugged. The older man nodded. He understood. After several seconds, he quietly said, "Your grandmother once spent 3 days negotiating a conflict zone evacuation." The teenager looked up. The veteran smiled faintly. "Trust me." Silence. Then, "She'll be fine." The statement should have been comforting. Instead, it created a new question. Who exactly was his grandmother? Because the military locker, the stories, the reactions, the service record, everything seemed connected to something much larger than he understood. Back at the station, Sergeant Benson stood outside interview room 2 once again, watching through the glass. The general sat quietly, hands folded, patient, waiting, not behaving like someone trapped, not behaving like someone afraid, behaving like someone who understood time. The realization bothered him, because experienced people often understood something others didn't. Finally, the sergeant entered the room, closed the door, sat down. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Benson exhaled slowly. "General." It was the first time anyone at the station used her rank. The word hung in the air. Heavy, meaningful. The general looked toward him. No reaction. No satisfaction. Nothing. Just attention. The sergeant rubbed one hand across his face. "I think there are some questions we should have asked earlier." Silence. Then the general answered softly. "Usually there are." The statement landed harder than criticism ever could. Because it wasn't an accusation. It was experience. And sitting inside a small interview room beneath fluorescent lights, Sergeant Mark Benson suddenly realized something uncomfortable. The situation was no longer moving toward confirmation. It was moving toward revelation. And somewhere beyond the walls of the station, the first phone call that could change everything was getting closer. The request came just before sunset. Simple, reasonable, and somehow, it made the entire station nervous. General Evelyn Brooks sat in the same interview room she had occupied for most of the day. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The clock on the wall continued its slow march forward. Outside the room, officers moved through hallways pretending everything was normal. Nobody seemed fully convinced anymore. Sergeant Mark Benson stood outside the door, holding a paper cup of coffee. Cold coffee. He hadn't realized how long he'd been carrying it. The general's words from earlier remained stuck in his head. Usually there are questions. The entire day now felt like one long unanswered question. The sergeant finally opened the interview room door, stepped inside, closed it behind him. The general looked up, calm, patient, the same as always. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Benson sat down. "You've been cooperative all day." The statement sounded obvious. Because it was. The general nodded once. "Yes." The sergeant rubbed one hand across his jaw, thinking carefully, choosing words carefully, something he wished more people had done earlier. Finally, "Is there anyone you'd like us to contact?" Silence. The general looked toward him, not surprised, not relieved, simply listening. Then, "Yes." The answer came softly. The sergeant waited. For the first time all day, the general seemed to consider her words more carefully than usual. Not because she was hiding something, because she understood consequences. Finally, she said, "I would like one phone call." Silence. The request sounded ordinary, almost disappointing. No demands, no threats, no lawyers, no speeches, just one phone call. The sergeant nodded slowly. "That's reasonable." The general offered a small smile. Very small. "Thank you." Minutes later, she was escorted to a small administrative office near the rear of the station. A desk, a computer, a telephone. Nothing special. Officer Tyler Reed stood nearby with folded arms, watching, still skeptical, still defensive. The younger officer had spent most of the afternoon convincing himself everything would work out, that the military ID was fake, that the confusion would resolve itself, that his instincts were right. because the alternative felt dangerous. The general sat quietly beside the desk. The handcuffs had finally been removed. Not because anyone admitted a mistake, because procedure allowed it. The distinction mattered. Sergeant Benson placed the phone in front of her. "You can make your call." Silence. The general nodded once, picked up the receiver, then dialed from memory. No notes. No contacts list. No hesitation. A long number. One digit at a time. Officer Reed watched, trying not to appear interested. Failing. The line rang once. Twice. Then someone answered. The general's posture changed slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough. "Good afternoon." Silence. Then, "This is General Evelyn Brooks." The room became very quiet. Officer Reed rolled his eyes slightly. The sergeant didn't, because something about the conversation felt different. The general continued. "Yes." Pause. "Currently at the Willow Creek Police Department." Another pause. Longer this time. Then no. Silence. The general listened carefully. No emergency. Pause. Just a misunderstanding. Officer Reed almost laughed. Almost. Because nobody described an arrest as a misunderstanding. Except apparently she did. The general remained silent for several seconds. Listening. Then, "Thank you." Pause. "I appreciate it." Another pause. Finally, "Yes, sir." Click. The receiver settled gently back into its cradle. The entire phone call lasted less than 2 minutes. No arguments. No explanations. No dramatic revelations. Just a conversation. Officer Reed frowned. Immediately. "That's it." The general looked toward him. "Yes." The answer somehow irritated him. "You called the Pentagon?" "Yes." Again. Simple. Calm. Direct. The young officer laughed. Not because he found it funny. Because he didn't know what else to do. "The Pentagon." Silence. The general said nothing. The sergeant watched her carefully. Not the words. The confidence. People bluffing usually performed confidence. People telling the truth rarely needed to. The difference mattered. A lot. The general stood. "May I return to the interview room?" The question surprised everyone. No demands. No pressure. No expectation. Just patience. Again. Always patience. Sergeant Benson nodded. Of course. Several minutes later, she sat back at the metal table. The same chair. The same room. The same calm expression. Outside, the station resumed its normal rhythm. Or tried to. Officer Reed returned to his desk. Shook his head. Laughed once. The Pentagon. The words sounded ridiculous. Several officers smiled nervously. Nobody laughed with him. That bothered him. Because 6 hours earlier, everyone would have laughed. Now, not so much. The station had changed. Questions had become doubts. Doubts had become concerns. And concerns were becoming something else entirely. The first phone rang at 6:14 p.m. A dispatcher answered. Listened. Then frowned. The second phone rang less than a minute later. Then another. Then another. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Something was happening. Nobody understood what. Not yet. Inside interview room 2, General Evelyn Brooks sat quietly listening to the distant sound of ringing telephones echoing through the station. The old clock continued ticking on the wall. Steady, patient, unhurried, the same way she had been all day. Because some people spend their lives reacting to events. Others spend their lives understanding what comes next. And somewhere beyond the walls of the Willow Creek Police Department, people at the Pentagon had just learned exactly where General Evelyn Brooks was. The consequences were already moving. The station simply hadn't seen them arrive yet. The first phone call ended at 6:14 p.m. By 6:20 p.m., nobody inside the station was smiling anymore. Not even Officer Tyler Reed. Especially not Officer Tyler Reed. The atmosphere had changed. Completely. Not because anybody understood what was happening. Because nobody did. And uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. The front desk phone rang again. Then again. Then again. Different callers. Different numbers. Same result. Dispatchers listened. Transferred calls. Looked confused. Then increasingly concerned. Sergeant Mark Benson stood near the communications desk watching it unfold. The pattern bothered him. A lot. 1 phone call. Normal. 2. Maybe coincidence. 5. Not coincidence. The dispatcher covered the receiver with one hand. Then looked toward the sergeant. Mark. The tone immediately got his attention. What? The dispatcher swallowed. State Military Affairs Office. Silence. The sergeant stared. What? The dispatcher repeated it. Slower. State Military Affairs Office. Nobody in the room spoke. Officer Reed looked up from his desk, frowning. The dispatcher listened for several more seconds, then transferred the call. The station commander answered, listened, spoke briefly, then stood up. Immediately. That alone was unusual. People stand when someone important enters a room, or when someone important appears on the phone. The commander remained standing for the entire conversation. Nobody missed that. Not a single person. The call ended. The commander looked around the room. His expression had changed. Not panic. Not fear. Concern. Professional concern. The kind people wear when they realize they don't possess enough information. Officer Reed finally stood. What's going on? The commander looked toward him, then away. That bothered Reed immediately. Because people only avoid eye contact when they don't like the answer. We're verifying some information. The explanation sounded weak. Everyone knew it. Another phone rang. The communications supervisor answered. Listened. Then suddenly sat straighter. Very straight. Yes, sir. Pause. Understood, sir. Pause. Immediately, sir. Silence spread through the room. Nobody needed to hear the other side of the conversation. The response told the story. Something important was happening. Very important. Meanwhile, inside interview room 2, General Evelyn Brooks sat quietly at the metal table. The same chair. The same room. The same calm expression. A young officer passed by the window, looked inside, then kept walking. 30 seconds later he returned, looked again, then left. The general noticed. Of course she did. People always become curious when uncertainty enters a building. The clock continued ticking softly. Steady. Patient. Unhurried. Exactly like her. Across town, Ethan Brooks sat inside his pickup truck parked outside the police station. The teenager refused to leave. The sun had already started setting. Orange lights stretched across the parking lot. Long shadows. Long day. His phone suddenly vibrated. A text message. From one of the ROTC cadets. Dude. Everybody's talking about it. Another message arrived immediately. Is it true she's really a general? Then another. Somebody said the Pentagon got involved. Ethan stared at the screen. For the first time all day, he didn't know the answer. Back inside the station, Sergeant Benson entered the records office, closed the door, locked it, then opened the military verification report that had just arrived. The document loaded slowly. One page, then another, then another. His eyes moved across the screen and stopped. Silence. Pure silence. The sergeant read the page again, then leaned back slowly. Because the report didn't create answers. It destroyed doubts. General Evelyn Brooks. United States Army. Verified. Current status. Active. The sergeant felt his stomach drop. Not retired. Not former. Not honorary. Active. He continued reading. Then stopped again. The rank confirmation appeared. Brigadier General. Verified. The room suddenly felt smaller. Much smaller. For several seconds, he simply stared at the screen. Unable to move. Unable to think. Because one realization kept repeating itself. They hadn't arrested someone pretending to be a general. They had arrested an actual general. Still wearing her uniform. Still carrying legitimate credentials. Still telling the truth from the very beginning. The sergeant closed his eyes briefly. Then exhaled. Slowly. Outside. The records office, Officer Reed waited. Growing impatient. The door finally opened. The younger officer immediately stepped forward. What did you find? Silence. Benson looked at him. Really looked at him. The same way someone looks at a person standing too close to the edge of a cliff. Finally, Tyler. Pause. She's real. The words landed like concrete. Officer Reed blinked. What? The sergeant handed him the report. The younger officer scanned the first page. Then the second. Then the verification section. The color slowly drained from his face. No. The response came automatically. Instinctively. Because accepting the truth meant accepting everything that came with it. The assumptions. The arrest. The handcuffs. The crowd. The humiliation. The mistake. Another phone rang. Then another. Then another. The station commander emerged from his office. Moving quickly now. Very quickly. Everyone listened. The room immediately fell silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The commander looked around the station. Then toward interview room 2. His jaw tightened. Finally he said, "Nobody talks to General Brooks unless I authorize it." Silence. Absolute silence. Because for the first time all day, the title wasn't being questioned anymore. General. And standing in the middle of the suddenly silent police station, Officer Tyler Reed felt something he hadn't felt once since this entire situation began. Not confidence, not authority, not certainty, fear. Because somewhere beyond the walls of the Willow Creek Police Department, people far above his pay grade had already started paying attention. And this story was only getting bigger. The word spread through the station in less than 5 minutes. Not officially, not through announcements, through whispers. The way important news always travels. General. Not the woman. Not the suspect. Not the detainee. General. People stopped saying her name casually. Stopped making assumptions. Stopped speaking quite so loudly. The atmosphere inside the Willow Creek Police Department felt completely different now. Like a storm approaching that nobody could see yet. Only feel. Officer Tyler Reed sat at his desk staring at the verification report. The pages hadn't changed. He had. General Evelyn Brooks. Verified. Active duty. Verified. Army General. Verified. The young officer rubbed both hands across his face. Then read the report again. Nothing changed. The truth remained exactly where he left it. Across the room, Sergeant Mark Benson stood beside the station commander reviewing a growing stack of notes. Phone logs. Verification records. Military confirmations. The pile kept getting larger. That wasn't a good sign. The commander's office phone rang again. Immediately, the man answered, listened, then stood up. Again. Nobody missed it this time. The station fell almost completely silent. The commander listened for nearly 30 seconds. Never interrupted. Never spoke. Finally, yes, sir. Pause. Understood. Pause. Absolutely. Click. The room remained frozen. The commander slowly lowered the receiver, then looked toward Benson. Conference room. The words sounded simple. They weren't. Within moments, the station leadership gathered inside a small conference room near the rear hallway. The blinds were closed. The door was shut. Voices stayed low. Officer Reed wasn't invited. That bothered him immediately, because all day he had been at the center of everything. Now, he was being pushed to the outside. That scared him more than he wanted to admit. Inside the conference room, the station commander placed a folder onto the table. Nobody spoke. Finally, Pentagon Liaison Office. Silence. The commander opened the folder. Several printed emails sat inside. Official headers. Official seals. Official language. Nobody liked what they were seeing. Sergeant Benson read one paragraph. Then another. His stomach tightened. The wording wasn't angry. That somehow made it worse. Professional. Controlled. Precise. Exactly the way people spoke when they didn't need to raise their voices. One line stood out immediately. Identity confirmed. Another. Immediate clarification requested. Another. Senior military leadership notified. Silence. Pure silence. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Not because someone was threatening them. Because nobody was. The Pentagon wasn't yelling. The Pentagon wasn't demanding. The Pentagon was asking questions. And questions from that level carried weight. Outside the conference room, Officer Reed paced beside the hallway, trying not to look nervous. Failing. Every officer passing him looked differently now. Not hostile. Not supportive. Different. The certainty he carried all morning was gone, replaced by something far less comfortable. Reflection. Meanwhile, inside interview room 2, General Evelyn Brooks sat quietly watching evening shadows stretch across the wall. The station had become noticeably quieter. People walking past now glanced through the glass, then quickly looked away. The change was obvious. The general noticed. Of course she did. People often reveal themselves most clearly after certainty disappears. The door opened softly. A young officer entered. The same officer who brought her water earlier. She looked nervous again. General. No hesitation this time. No uncertainty. General. The young officer placed a fresh bottle of water on the table, then quietly said, I'm sorry this happened. Silence. The statement lingered inside the room. The general looked toward her. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then, thank you. The officer nodded, started toward the door, then stopped. Something clearly bothered her. Finally, are you angry? The question sounded genuine, not professional, human. The general considered it carefully, then looked toward the window, the hallway, the station, the people moving beyond the glass. Finally, no. The officer looked surprised. Really? A faint smile appeared. Anger doesn't help people learn. Silence. The young officer stood there for several seconds, thinking, then quietly left. The room returned to silence. Back in the conference room, the station commander received another call. This one lasted less than 10 seconds. The effect was immediate. His expression changed. Not concern anymore. Concern had evolved into realization. The commander slowly lowered the phone, then looked around the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Finally, he said, "They know." Silence. The phrase landed heavily. Sergeant Benson frowned. "Who?" The commander looked toward the closed conference room door, then toward interview room 2 somewhere beyond the hallway. Finally, the people above her. Nobody moved, because everybody suddenly understood the same thing at exactly the same moment. This was no longer about verifying identity. That part was over. This was about consequences. And somewhere far beyond Willow Creek, people with stars on their shoulders had already learned that one of their own had spent an entire day sitting inside a local police station. The station simply hadn't seen the next chapter arrive yet, but it was coming. Fast. The first black SUV arrived at 8:03 p.m. No sirens. No flashing lights. No drama. Just a vehicle rolling quietly into the parking lot of the Willow Creek Police Department. At first, nobody paid much attention. Small towns saw government vehicles all the time. State officials, inspectors, administrators. Nothing unusual. Then a second SUV appeared. And a third. The atmosphere inside the station changed immediately. Not because anyone knew exactly who was arriving. Because everyone understood one thing. People rarely traveled in groups like that unless something important was happening. Officer Tyler Reed noticed the vehicles through the front window. His stomach tightened instantly. The same feeling had been growing all evening. Slowly, relentlessly. Now it felt impossible to ignore. The convoy stopped. Engines shut off. Doors opened. Several men and women stepped out. Dark suits. Military uniforms. Professional expressions. Purposeful movement. Nobody looked confused. Nobody looked uncertain. They looked like people who already knew why they were there. Inside the station, conversations died almost immediately. Phones stopped ringing. Keyboards stopped clicking. Even the dispatch desk seemed quieter. The front doors opened. Silence. A tall Army colonel entered first. Silver Eagle insignia. Perfect uniform. Sharp posture. 2 civilians followed. Then another officer. Then a man whose presence immediately changed the room. Not because he was loud. Because he wasn't. People who carry real authority rarely need volume. The station commander recognized him instantly and stood up. Immediately, the visitor extended his hand. Lieutenant General Robert Hayes. Silence. Pure silence. Several officers visibly froze. The name meant nothing to some people. Everything to others. The station commander shook his hand. "Sir." The response came automatically, almost reflexively, because people spend years learning how to recognize rank. And Lieutenant General Robert Hayes carried a lot of it. The general glanced around the room once. Only once. That was enough. His eyes settled briefly on Officer Reed, then moved on. Not angry, not emotional, just observant. That somehow felt worse. The visitor spoke calmly. "We're here regarding General Evelyn Brooks." Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The entire building suddenly felt smaller. Much smaller. The station commander nodded. Of course. The words sounded careful now. Very careful. Lieutenant General Hayes glanced toward the hallway leading to interview room 2. "Is she all right?" Simple question. The station commander answered immediately. "Yes, sir." The Army officer nodded once. Nothing more. No accusations. No demands. No threats. That restraint made everyone even more uncomfortable. Because the people most capable of causing problems often don't need to announce it. Meanwhile, inside interview room 2, General Evelyn Brooks sat quietly at the metal table. The same room. The same chair. The same calm expression. Footsteps echoed through the hallway. Several sets. Professional. Measured. Purposeful. The general looked toward the door, then returned her attention to the clock. Not surprised. Not excited. Just waiting. The door opened. Sergeant Mark Benson stepped inside first. His expression immediately revealed everything. The uncertainty was gone. The doubt was gone. Only realization remained. Behind him stood Lieutenant General Robert Hayes. For the first time all day, General Evelyn Brooks smiled. A real smile. Small. Warm. Genuine. "Robert." The lieutenant general laughed softly. "Evelyn." Silence. The The simple exchange hit harder than any speech could have, because it immediately established something. They weren't strangers. They weren't distant colleagues. They knew each other. Well, the lieutenant general looked around the interview room, the metal table, the fluorescent lights, the camera in the corner, then back toward her. For a brief moment, disappointment crossed his face. Not anger, disappointment. Long day. The general nodded. A little. Several officers standing in the hallway stared. Because only two types of people answer that way after spending an entire day detained. People in shock, or people with extraordinary self-control. Nobody believed Evelyn Brooks was in shock. Lieutenant General Hayes pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence felt strangely respectful, like two people who didn't need to prove anything to each other. Finally, the Army officer exhaled slowly. Then, "You know, half the Pentagon's talking about this." A faint smile touched Evelyn's face. "I was afraid of that." Several officers nearly stopped breathing, because the statement sounded absurd. Half the Pentagon. Yet somehow nobody doubted it anymore. Not after tonight. Not after the calls. The confirmations. The arrivals. Outside the room, Officer Tyler Reed stood motionless in the hallway, watching through the open doorway, listening. The reality finally settling in. The woman he handcuffed, the woman he detained, the woman he doubted, wasn't merely a general. She was a general important enough that senior military leadership crossed state lines to personally ensure she was okay. That realization landed heavily, very heavily, and standing outside interview room, two beneath fluorescent lights that suddenly felt much too bright. Officer Tyler Reed realized something that made his stomach turn. The story was no longer about whether General Evelyn Brooks was who she claimed to be. That question had been answered. Completely. The next question would be much harder. What happened to the people who never bothered to believe her? The hallway outside interview room, too, had never felt so crowded. Yet nobody wanted to be there. Not really. Because every officer standing outside that room knew the same thing. The facts were no longer uncertain. The identity was no longer uncertain. The mistake was no longer uncertain. Only the consequences remained unknown. And that was somehow worse. Lieutenant General Robert Hayes sat across from General Evelyn Brooks. The conversation remained calm, professional, almost ordinary, which made it extraordinary. Outside the room, officers watched two senior military leaders speak as if they were old friends meeting for coffee, not as if one of them had spent the day in police custody. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Robert leaned back slightly. "Your grandson okay?" The question came first. Not the arrest, not the paperwork, not the embarrassment. "Ethan." The general nodded. "He's worried." A faint smile appeared. As expected, the lieutenant general nodded, then quietly said, "He never left." Silence. For the first time all evening, something shifted in Evelyn's eyes. Not concern. Affection. That sounds like him. Outside the room, Sergeant Mark Benson lowered his gaze. Because the exchange felt painfully human. The entire day had become paperwork. Procedures. Reports. Mistakes. And suddenly he remembered there had been a family involved. A grandson. A public humiliation. Real people. That realization landed heavily. Across the hallway, Officer Tyler Reed stood alone. Nobody stood beside him anymore. Nobody asked how he was doing. Nobody offered reassurance. Not because they hated him. Because nobody knew what to say. The young officer replayed the morning over and over. Step away from the vehicle. Turn around. Handcuffs. Every decision looked worse now. Not because of her rank. Because of what he had ignored. The identification. The uniform. The questions. The dignity. All the opportunities to slow down. All the opportunities he didn't take. Inside the interview room, Lieutenant General Hayes finally glanced toward the station commander, who stood quietly near the doorway, waiting. The Army officer's voice remained calm. "Walk me through what happened." Silence. The commander swallowed, then began explaining. The witness report, the vehicle description, the misunderstanding, the detention, the verification process. Every sentence sounded weaker than the one before it, because explanations often do. Once the truth arrives, nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Nobody defended anything. The station commander finished speaking, then fell silent. The room remained quiet for several seconds. Lieutenant General Hayes nodded slowly, then asked a question nobody expected. "Did General Brooks cooperate?" The commander blinked. "Yes." "Completely." "Yes." Silence. The Army officer nodded again. Then, was she respectful? The commander hesitated, because the answer felt obvious. Yes. Again. Silence. Lieutenant General Hayes folded his hands together. Then let me save everyone some time. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room felt smaller. The Army officer looked around carefully, one face at a time, then quietly said, "The problem isn't that a mistake was made." Silence. Officer Reed felt his stomach tighten, because somehow he already knew what was coming next. The lieutenant general continued. Mistakes happen. Nobody disagreed. Not a single person. Then, the problem is how long it took people to question their assumptions. Silence. Pure silence. The sentence landed harder than any threat ever could, because it was true. Nobody had verified first. Nobody had slowed down. Nobody had asked enough questions. They had assumed, and assumptions had done the rest. Officer Reed stared at the floor, unable to look anywhere else. The young officer remembered the military ID, remembered dismissing it, remembered laughing. The memory felt painful now, not because somebody criticized him, because nobody had. The truth was doing that work on its own. Lieutenant General Hayes finally stood. The movement immediately drew everyone's attention. The room went silent again. He looked toward General Brooks, then toward the officers. Finally, "Do you know what the most impressive part of today is?" Nobody answered. The Army officer smiled faintly. She never once used her rank. Silence. The statement hit every person in the room differently, because it was true. General Evelyn Brooks could have identified herself repeatedly, demanded special treatment, made phone calls immediately, escalated the situation. She hadn't. Not once. She simply told the truth. Again, and again, and again. The room remained quiet. Very quiet. Lieutenant. General Hayes looked toward Evelyn. "You know, most people would have lost their temper by now." The general smiled softly. "That wouldn't have helped. Simple. Direct. Final." Sergeant Benson closed his eyes briefly, because at that moment he finally understood why people respected her. It wasn't the stars on her shoulders. It wasn't the title. It wasn't the Pentagon. It was discipline. Real discipline. The kind that remains when nobody is watching, and the kind that remains when everybody is watching. Outside the station windows, the last sunlight disappeared below the horizon. Darkness settled across Willow Creek. Inside the building, nobody was thinking about rank anymore. Nobody was thinking about military prestige. Nobody was thinking about the Pentagon. They were thinking about something far more uncomfortable. The difference between authority and character. And standing quietly inside Interview Room 2, General Evelyn Brooks possessed far more of the second than anyone had recognized that morning. The station should have felt relieved. The identity was confirmed. The misunderstanding was exposed. The military leadership had arrived. The truth was no longer in question. By all logic, the tension should have disappeared. It didn't, because now everyone was waiting for the same thing. Consequences. The question lingered in every hallway, every office, every conversation. What was General Evelyn Brooks going to do? Nobody asked it out loud. Nobody needed to. The possibility hung over the station like a storm cloud. Officer Tyler Reed sat alone at his desk, the same desk where he had spent most of the afternoon defending his decisions. Now he wasn't defending anything. He simply stared at the blank incident report on his computer screen, unable to type, unable to focus. The events replayed endlessly. The military ID, the vehicle registration, the questions, the handcuffs, the crowd. Every moment looked worse than the one before it. Across the station, Sergeant Mark Benson wasn't feeling much better. The difference was simple. Tyler feared punishment. Mark feared responsibility. Because deep down he knew something painful. He had opportunities to stop the situation, and he didn't. The realization sat heavily on his shoulders. Meanwhile, inside a small conference room, General Evelyn Brooks sat with Lieutenant General Robert Hayes and the station commander. Coffee rested on the table, untouched. The conversation remained calm, professional, quiet. The station commander finally cleared his throat. "General." Silence. The title sounded different now, not because of rank, because of respect. The commander looked directly at her. Then, "I owe you an apology." The room fell silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. The man continued. "What happened today should not have happened." Pause. "We failed to verify information." Another pause. "And we failed to slow down." Silence. The words sounded sincere. Because they were. No excuses. No explanations. No attempts to spread blame. Just accountability. General Brooks listened quietly. The same way she listened to everyone. Completely. When the commander finished speaking, she remained silent for several seconds. Thinking. Then finally nodded once. Thank you. That was all. The commander blinked. Because somehow he expected more. Anger. Frustration. Something. Instead, he received gratitude. The simplicity of it made the apology feel even heavier. Lieutenant General Hayes watched quietly, saying nothing, because sometimes leadership means knowing when not to speak. The station commander hesitated, then asked the question everyone was avoiding. Will you be filing a complaint? Silence. The room suddenly felt smaller. Outside the conference room, several officers accidentally found reasons to remain nearby. Not eavesdropping. Exactly. Just close enough to hear. The answer mattered. A lot. General Brooks folded her hands calmly on the table, then looked toward the station commander. For several seconds, she said nothing. The pause felt endless. Finally, what would that accomplish? Silence. Nobody answered immediately, because the question wasn't rhetorical. It was genuine. The commander looked surprised. I don't understand. The general nodded slightly. That's fair. Then she leaned back. Not dramatically, not emotionally, simply settling into the chair. I've spent most of my life leading people. Silence. The room listened. When people make mistakes, pause. You have two choices. Nobody moved. You can humiliate them. Silence. Or you can help them become better. The words settled gently into the room. No accusation. No anger. Just truth. Lieutenant General Hayes smiled faintly, because the answer sounded exactly like Evelyn. The station commander stared quietly. The general continued. The mistake today wasn't the arrest. Silence. It wasn't even the handcuffs. Nobody breathed. Then, it was the assumption. The sentence landed hard. Because everyone knew it was true. Nobody had looked at the evidence first. Nobody had slowed down enough to ask the right questions. People saw what they expected to see, and acted accordingly. General Brooks looked toward the door, toward the officers beyond it, toward the people carrying the weight of the day, then quietly said, if this experience teaches that lesson, pause, then it wasn't completely wasted. Silence. Pure silence. Officer Tyler Reed stood frozen outside the conference room, unable to move, because the words hit him harder than any punishment could. The general wasn't protecting him. She was giving him something much more difficult, a chance to change. The young officer lowered his eyes. For the first time all day, he understood exactly how wrong he had been. Not about the identity, about the assumption. Hours later, as the meeting finally ended, Lieutenant General Hayes walked beside Evelyn toward the station exit. The building had grown quiet. Most of the excitement was gone. Only reflection remained. Near the front doors, Officer Reed stood waiting. Nervous, uncomfortable, determined. The general stopped. The young officer swallowed hard, then finally spoke. I'm sorry. The words came out rough. Honest. Human. Silence followed. The general looked at him for several seconds, then nodded. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just enough. The young officer felt something loosen inside his chest. Not relief. Responsibility. The beginning of it. As General Evelyn Brooks stepped out of the station into the cool evening air, everyone inside watched her leave. Not because of the stars on her shoulders. Not because of the Pentagon. Not because of her rank. But because she had every reason to seek revenge. And instead, she chose leadership. And for many people inside that building, that choice would become the most important lesson of the entire 3 weeks later. The auditorium was full. Rows of cadets sat in pressed uniforms. Families filled the seats behind them. Flags stood along the stage beneath bright lights. The annual ROTC Leadership Recognition Ceremony had finally arrived. And for Ethan Brooks, it felt very different from the last military event. The teenager stood near the back of the auditorium adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time. Nervous. Again. Some things never changed. You've checked that tie 6 times. The voice came from behind him. Ethan turned, then laughed. Only 6. General Evelyn Brooks smiled faintly. The same small smile. The same calm expression. The same quiet confidence. 3 weeks had passed since the arrest. 3 weeks since the police station. 3 weeks since the phone call. 3 weeks since half the Pentagon suddenly learned where she was. And yet, she seemed completely unchanged. The general adjusted one side of Ethan's collar, then stepped back. There. The teenager looked down. That's it. That's it. Silence. Then, you always make everything sound easy. The general glanced toward the auditorium doors. No. Pause. I just don't make things harder than they need to be. The answer sounded simple. Like most of her answers. The trouble was, they usually made sense hours later. Inside the auditorium, people began taking their seats. The ceremony was about to start. The master of ceremonies approached the microphone. The crowd settled. The room grew quiet. Ethan took his place with the other cadets. General Brooks sat several rows back, near the aisle, away from attention, exactly where she preferred to be. The ceremony began. Awards, announcements, scholarships, recognition, life moving forward, the way life always does. Several speakers addressed the audience. Military officers, community leaders, educators. Then came the final speaker. The room fell silent as the announcer stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, pause. It is our honor to welcome Brigadier General Evelyn Brooks. Applause filled the auditorium. Warm, respectful, genuine. The general stood, walked calmly toward the stage. No dramatic entrance, no performance, just quiet dignity. The same dignity she carried into the police station. The same dignity she carried out of it. She stepped behind the podium, looked across the audience, the cadets, the families, the veterans, then began speaking. Leadership is often misunderstood. Silence filled the room. People listened. Many people believe leadership begins when others follow you. Pause. I disagree. The audience remained completely quiet. The general looked toward the cadets. I think leadership begins the moment you are forced to choose between your ego and your character. Ethan felt himself sit a little straighter. Because somehow, he knew this wasn't just a speech. It was a lesson. The general continued. Every person in this room will eventually make a mistake. Silence. You will misjudge situations. Pause. You will misunderstand people. Another pause. You will get things wrong. Nobody moved. The room listened. Then, the question isn't whether you'll make mistakes. The general's voice remained calm, steady, certain. The question is what you'll do after you discover them. Silence. No mention of the arrest. No mention of the police station. No mention of handcuffs. She didn't need to mention them. The lesson was bigger than the event. Much bigger. The speech lasted less than 10 minutes. No dramatic stories. No emotional performance. Just wisdom. The kind earned through experience. When she finished, the audience stood. Applause echoed through the auditorium. Long, sincere, powerful. The general nodded politely, then returned to her seat. No celebration. No attention-seeking. Just humility. After the ceremony ended, families gathered throughout the lobby. Photographs. Handshakes. Congratulations. Ethan eventually found his grandmother standing near a display of military history photographs. Alone, looking at an image from decades ago. A younger version of herself. The teenager approached quietly. You never told them. The general looked toward him. About what? The arrest. Silence. The general studied the old photograph, then looked back toward Ethan. No. The teenager frowned. Why not? The question lingered between them. A fair question. Maybe the most important one. The general considered it carefully, then smiled. A real smile. Warm. Gentle. The kind grandparents save for moments that matter. Finally she answered. Because leadership isn't about winning. Silence. The sounds of the lobby faded into the background. The general continued. It's about leaving people better than you found them. The words settled quietly between them. Simple. Honest. Complete. Ethan looked down, thinking, then nodded slowly. Because suddenly he understood. The police officers. The commander. Officer Reed. She could have destroyed them. She had every opportunity. Every justification. Every reason. And she chose something harder. Grace. The general placed a hand on his shoulder. Come on. The teenager smiled. Where are we going? The general started walking toward the exit. Dinner. The answer came immediately. Ethan laughed. That's it. Without looking back, she replied. That's it. Outside, the evening sun painted the sky gold. Families crossed the parking lot. Cadets celebrated with loved ones. Life moved forward. The general and her grandson walked side by side toward the car. No cameras. No headlines. No speeches. Just family. And as they disappeared into the warm evening light, one truth remained. The officers saw a black woman in uniform. They never imagined she outranked nearly everyone involved. But in the end, her rank wasn't what changed the story. Her character did, because power made people listen. But grace made them remember. And sometimes, that's the greater victory. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and tell us where you're watching from. Because the strongest leaders aren't remembered for the power they held. They're remembered for what they chose not to do with it.